Episode 1L, The Utah Massacres. The Mormon Church loves to paint itself as a persecuted people, especially after settling in Utah. But the reality? Far from innocent. The church and its members carried out brutal raids and massacres of their own, leaving a bloody trail across the West. These were the darkest years in Mormon history, where the line between victim and aggressor blurred beyond recognition. Let's take a look at least 7 violent incidents where the Mormon Church and its members weren't the victims, but the perpetrators. Since I have already done a video on the Mountain Meadow Massacre, I will not be covering it during this video. Part 1. Battle Creek Massacre, 1849. On March 5, 1849, the Battle Creek Massacre was one of the earliest violent encounters between Mormon settlers and indigenous tribes in Utah. It took place near present-day Pleasant Grove, Utah, and involved the Timpanogos Ute tribe. When the Mormons arrived in Utah in 1847, they encountered various indigenous groups, including the Utes. Relations were initially mixed, sometimes friendly, but often tense due to competition over land, food, and resources. Brigham Young and other church leaders viewed Native Americans as descendants of the Lamanites, a group described in the Book of Mormon as cursed but redeemable through conversion. Despite this, violence often accompanied interactions between Mormon settlers and indigenous groups. In early 1849, reports surfaced that some Timpanogos Utes had stolen horses from Mormon settlers in Salt Lake Valley. Brigham Young, determined to assert dominance over local tribes, ordered a punitive expedition, instructing Captain John Scott and a group of Mormon militiamen to chastise the Utes and retrieve the stolen horses. The Mormon militia tracked the Utes to a winter encampment near Battle Creek, close to present-day Pleasant Grove. The Utes were caught off guard. Rather than attempting negotiations, the Mormon militia launched a surprise attack. The Utes, taken by surprise, had little chance to defend themselves. The Battle Creek Massacre was a turning point in Mormon indigenous relations in Utah. It set a precedent for violence as a tool of control, leading to more conflicts, forced relocations, and massacres. The massacre also reflected Brigham Young's firm hand policy, which aimed to subdue Native American resistance through force. Part 2. The Provo River Massacre, the Battle at Fort Utah, 1850. The Provo River Massacre, also known as the Battle at Fort Utah, stands as one of the most horrific and savage episodes of Mormon Indian violence in the history of Utah. This bloody act, executed by Mormon settlers in February 1850, was a calculated and ruthless assault on the Timpanogos Ute people, culminating in the slaughter of anywhere from 40 to 100 men, along with at least one woman. Dozens more, mostly women and children, were enslaved, their lives forever marked by the cruelty of the Mormon settlers. The Timpanogos Utes, who had lived in Utah Valley for generations, were a people who relied on fishing, hunting, and seasonal migrations. Their existence was a natural part of the land. But to the Mormon settlers, led by Brigham Young, the indigenous population was nothing more than an obstacle to be wiped out, converted, or subjugated. Tensions mounted in 1849 as Mormon settlers began accusing the Utes of raiding their livestock and attacking their homes. Brigham Young, as always, responded with the zeal of a religious fanatic, ordering the fortification of Mormon settlements and the mass extermination or forced removal of any tribe seen as a threat. By January 1850, Young had declared that the Timpanogos must be destroyed if they didn't surrender. With Young's decree, Colonel John Scott was again called to lead a Mormon militia, tasked with launching a bloody attack on a Timpanogos encampment located along the Provo River near Fort Utah. What followed was nothing less than cold-blooded slaughter. For 2 days, the Mormon militia laid siege to the Timpanogos encampment. The Utes fought back fiercely, but they were outgunned and outmanned by the Mormon militia, armed with firearms and even a cannon. In a ruthless display of dominance, the militia murdered between 40 and 100 Timpanogos men and at least one woman, as well as hunting down and executing survivors who tried to flee into Rock Canyon or southward. Not a single Mormon militiaman died in the attack, and only 18 were injured from return fire. The disparity in casualties tells the brutal story. The Mormon settlers slaughtered the Timpanogos with impunity. The carnage didn't end with the massacre. After the killing spree, the Mormon militia took over 40 Timpanogos women, children, and a few men captive. Rather than granting mercy or seeking peaceful solutions, they were marched north to Salt Lake City and sold into slavery to Mormon families. a heinous yet all too common practice in the early Mormon settlements. The true depravity of the massacre was revealed in the aftermath. The decapitated heads of the slain Timpanogos were paraded and displayed on pikes at Fort Utah. As a chilling message to the survivors, their heads were mounted to intimidate the remaining Utes and crush any will to resist. These gruesome acts were not just about victory, they were about asserting a terrifying dominance. Mormon aggression and hypocrisy. While Brigham Young publicly called for the conversion of indigenous people, his actions screamed something much darker: violence, subjugation, and genocide. The massacre at Fort Utah was not a random event. It was part of a broader pattern of ruthless aggression by Mormon settlers to secure their territorial claims in Utah, no matter the cost. Part 3. The Aiken Massacre, November 1857. Another bloodbath at the hands of the Mormon militia during the Utah War. Another horrific chapter buried deep under the rug of history, and for good reason. The Aiken Massacre may not carry the same notoriety as the Mountain Meadows Massacre, but make no mistake, it was just as brutal and just as revealing of the unhinged violence that coursed through the veins of Mormon militia forces at the time. And yet, despite the bloodshed, the history of the Provo River Massacre is largely erased from Mormon narratives. When it is mentioned, it is often whitewashed, framed as a battle, rather than the systematic extermination and enslavement of indigenous people. A group of Southern California immigrants, including the Aiken family, were making their way to Oregon when they became the victims of a merciless ambush by a band of Mormon militants. The killers? The very same Mormon militia that was meant to defend their own people. Instead, they turned their rifles on anyone who wasn't one of them. Why? Because the Mormons were consumed by paranoia. They feared outsiders, loathed the very presence of federal troops, and saw anyone not of their faith as a potential threat. These immigrants weren't trespassing, they weren't a danger, they were simply passing through, minding their own business. But for the Mormons, that was a grave mistake. The most infuriating part of this tragedy? The Church has gone to great lengths to bury the truth about it. The details of the Aiken Massacre remain shrouded in uncertainty, conveniently lost in the chaos of history. You'll never hear about it in the LDS Church's sanitized history books. They'll talk about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, of course, but the Aiken Massacre doesn't fit the narrative they've worked so hard to sell. The question that's always left unanswered: was this violence authorized by the Church's higher-ups? Were Mormon leaders complicit in these bloody deeds? Or were they simply allowing their followers to act out of unchecked paranoia? The Aiken Massacre, like so many other atrocities committed during the Utah War, will never be fully acknowledged by the LDS Church, and so it is swept under the rug, just like the rest of their bloody history. Part 4. Other attacks on emigrant trains, 1857. In 1857, as tensions between Mormon settlers and the U.S. government reached a boiling point, multiple emigrant trains passing through Utah became targets of raids and attacks by the Mormon militia and their Native American allies. These smaller, yet equally violent incidents reflect the broader pattern of hostility and paranoia that marked the Utah War. The attacks on these emigrant trains were part of the Mormons' growing resistance to federal encroachment, with the militia justified in their minds as protecting both their land and their people from perceived outside threats. Emigrant trains were frequently targeted for robbery and harassment as they crossed the Utah Territory. The Mormons, often working with Native American groups, would ambush these trains, looting supplies and forcing emigrants to abandon their belongings. As the emigrants, many of whom were on their way to California or Oregon, passed through Mormon-controlled territory, they became increasingly vulnerable to attack. The Mormon militia, under the guise of protecting the territory, often saw these acts as part of a necessary resistance to federal forces and outsiders. As historian David L. Bigler notes, the Mormon militia's aggression against outsiders was often justified as defense against what they perceived as an imminent federal invasion. Fool's Errand, Utah War and the Mormon Rebellion, 2021. This sentiment of paranoia was deeply ingrained, with Brigham Young even predicting a 7-year siege as tensions grew between Mormons and the U.S. government, Utah History Encyclopedia. While these attacks were not on the scale of more infamous massacres, they still resulted in violence and death. Some emigrants were outright killed, and entire families were sometimes massacred in smaller, more isolated incidents. These killings were brutal, reflecting the deeply entrenched hostility felt by the Mormons towards outsiders. The Mormon militia's violent acts were seen as justified in their eyes, under the belief that the federal government and outsiders posed a direct threat to their sovereignty. Bigler explains that the raids and skirmishes along the emigrant trails contributed to the growing animosity between Mormons and the federal government, as the violence was often justified as a defensive act. Fool's Errand, 2021. This justification allowed the Mormon leadership to endorse these acts of violence, despite their devastating consequences for the emigrants. The Mormon leadership's response to these attacks was one of tacit approval, if not active encouragement. The raids were seen as part of a broader effort to protect Mormon territory from what they viewed as the encroaching federal government. As John S. McCormick points out, Mormon leaders, fearful of the U.S. government's intentions, viewed the emigrants as a threat and took steps to halt the flow of settlers into the region. The Utah War, A History of the Mormon Conflict with the Federal Government, 1998. The Mormon leadership, including Brigham Young, was deeply involved in stirring up the paranoia that led to the attacks, though the extent of direct involvement remains a subject of historical debate. These raids, though not on the same scale as the Mountain Meadows massacre, were part of a disturbing trend of Mormon resistance to federal authority. They helped solidify the growing narrative of Mormon defiance against the U.S. government and outsiders. Historian William G. Hartley notes that the Utah War was a violent period for emigrants passing through Mormon territory, with frequent raids on their trains. The Mormon Rebellion, America's First Civil War, 2009. These smaller attacks were integral to the larger context of territorial defense, violent, secretive, and indiscriminate, which set the stage for even bloodier confrontations as tensions with the federal government escalated. The attacks on emigrant trains in 1857 demonstrate the extent of Mormon resistance to federal authority and outsiders. Though less well known, these events highlight the volatile and violent nature of Mormon interactions with emigrants during the Utah War. The Mormon leadership, under Brigham Young, perpetuated a culture of violence that justified these raids and attacks as a means of defending their sovereignty. Part 5. Utah War, 1857-1858. The Utah War was a volatile clash between Mormon settlers and the United States government, an eruption fueled by deep-seated anger, fear, and resentment. This conflict was ignited not by foreign invaders or external threats, but by the growing defiance of the Mormon community, under Brigham Young's leadership, against the authority of the U.S. government. What started as a political confrontation quickly escalated into a violent standoff, marked by covert terrorism, sabotage, and open acts of rebellion. Background and tensions leading to the Utah War. By 1857, the Mormons, having left Missouri and Illinois, had carved out a thriving settlement in Utah territory. Yet their tenuous peace with the federal government was anything but secure. The U.S. government had grown increasingly concerned with Mormon practices, particularly polygamy, and their blatant defiance of federal laws. But the real breaking point came when President James Buchanan sent a new territorial governor without consulting Brigham Young. This direct slap in the face to Mormon self-rule lit the fuse of rebellion. Young, ever the firebrand, did not back down. He declared martial law and promised violent resistance against any U.S. intervention. As the U.S. Army advanced toward Utah, the Mormons, already paranoid and distrustful of outsiders, prepared for full-scale war. Young's rhetoric became sharper. "We will not submit to the dominion of the United States." The Mormons didn't just see themselves as settlers. They viewed themselves as a beleaguered people, fighting for their very survival against a government that had already tried to destroy them once. In this powder keg of tension, a dangerous new doctrine surfaced: blood atonement. Brigham Young, with his theological influence, began preaching that certain sins could only be forgiven through the shedding of the sinner's blood. This wasn't just a theological concept. It was a call to arms, a justification for violence against anyone seen as an enemy of the Mormon faith or a threat to their sovereignty. It provided a divine mandate for cold-blooded violence. As historian John S. McCormick observed, the doctrine of blood atonement fueled a culture of fear and violence among the Mormons, who believed they were acting under divine command to protect their community from perceived threats. This wasn't an isolated belief. It was ingrained in the very fabric of Mormon resistance. The specter of bloodshed was woven into the rhetoric of Mormon leaders, inciting acts of aggression against perceived enemies. This doctrine, while not universally accepted within the community, was wielded by leaders like Young as a powerful tool for rallying followers to violent action. It wasn't just about defending the territory, it was about exacting revenge for perceived slights and securing Mormon dominance at any cost. For many Mormons, the Utah War was not just a battle for land, it was a quest for retribution. The memories of the extermination order in Missouri, which called for the murder or removal of Mormons, and the mob murder of Joseph Smith in Illinois were still fresh wounds. These events didn't just anger the Mormons. They festered into a burning desire for vengeance against those they saw as the architects of their suffering. As historian David L. Bigler put it, the specter of past violence loomed large in the minds of the Mormons. The Utah War became as much about revenge for their suffering in Missouri and Illinois as it was about defending their homes in Utah. The Mormon community, devastated and humiliated by supposed past persecution, viewed the U.S. government as the enemy responsible for their plight. Any violence in the Utah War was not just defensive, it was perceived payback. They weren't just fighting to protect their homes, they were fighting to make the U.S. government pay for alleged crimes against them. The Utah War never erupted into full-scale fighting. Despite the mounting tension and the presence of armed forces on both sides, the conflict ended without major battles. In 1858, a tenuous peace was brokered, with the Mormon leadership agreeing to accept the new federal governor and the U.S. Army stationing a small contingent in the region. But this so-called peace didn't resolve the underlying issues. It merely postponed an inevitable reckoning. The aftermath was a period of lingering bitterness and distrust. The Mormon community, forever shaped by their years of perceived persecution, viewed the U.S. government with ever-deepening disdain. Brigham Young's legacy as a leader of defiance remained intact, and his advocacy for Mormon sovereignty, self-defense, and violence continued to influence the church long after the war's official end. The war may have subsided, but the ideology that fueled it did not. Part 6. The Black Hawk War, 1865. The Black Hawk War, 1865, was not just a conflict. It was a blood-soaked display of betrayal, brutality, and outright greed by Mormon settlers who viewed Native Americans as little more than obstacles to their divine mission. This war didn't just happen because of tensions or misunderstandings. It was the result of relentless encroachment, theft, and a complete disregard for the humanity of the native tribes that had been living in the region for centuries. This war wasn't about defense, it was about domination. Mormon settlers, desperate to establish their religious stronghold, infringed upon lands that didn't belong to them. As Mormon communities expanded, they shoved aside the Utes, Paiutes, and Shoshones, forcing these tribes into a corner. These native peoples didn't just lose their land, they lost their way of life. And instead of helping to preserve peace, the Mormons' expansionist mindset, driven by the belief that they were the chosen people, pushed these tribes into violent resistance. The war didn't start in 1865, it had been brewing for years. The settlers, who had already shown a penchant for pushing boundaries and ignoring treaties, met the Native Americans with nothing but violence and disdain. Black Hawk, a Ute leader, had originally tried to broker peace with the Mormons, but instead of receiving respect or negotiations, he and his people faced broken promises, betrayal, and unchecked hostility. So, Black Hawk did what anyone would do in the face of relentless aggression. He fought back. Raids erupted across Mormon settlements as Native American warriors retaliated, burning homes, stealing livestock, and sending a clear message: you cannot simply take what does not belong to you. But the Mormons didn't see it that way. They saw these acts of resistance not as the rightful defense of their land, but as proof of the savagery they'd always assumed about the native tribes. And they responded the only way they knew how, with military force and brutal retaliation. The Black Hawk War was a long, ugly grind. There were no grand battles or heroic last stands, just relentless ambushes, guerrilla attacks, and slaughters. Mormon militias weren't defending their homes, they were ruthlessly hunting down Native Americans, often indiscriminately. Meanwhile, native warriors, led by Black Hawk, hit back with brutal raids, their strategy designed to cripple Mormon settlements by targeting livestock, supplies, and settlements. Both sides bled, but the violence was never just a clash of civilizations. It was the Mormons waging war on those whose lands they had stolen. Don't be fooled. This wasn't just a regional skirmish. This was Brigham Young's war, as he rallied the settlers to defend their land at any cost, even if that meant waging all-out war against those who dared to resist. Under Young's leadership, the Mormon community faced not just external threats, but an internal, self-imposed war, a battle to protect their self-declared destiny. Young encouraged violence, using blood atonement, the belief that certain sins could only be forgiven through bloodshed, as justification. The message was clear. The Native Americans were expendable, and if it meant their blood would spill to preserve Mormon power, then so be it. The war dragged on for years. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but there was no clear victor. The Mormon militias, entrenched in their settlements, kept their positions, while the Native American tribes, driven from their land, kept fighting, losing warriors, families, and their way of life. Mormons didn't win the war, they just outlasted their opponents. The Utes, who fought the hardest, were forced to surrender, signing treaties they had no choice but to agree to, while Black Hawk himself died in 1870, his resistance crushed, his people decimated. So what's the legacy of the Black Hawk War? It's a war that never should have happened. It's the story of Mormons driving their own agenda, one of domination, dispossession, and ultimately betrayal. While many see this as a conflict of survival for the Mormons, it's a bloody chapter of systemic violence and displacement of the Native Americans, who were simply fighting to hold on to what was theirs. By the time the war ended, the damage was done. Native tribes were broken, their culture and history systematically erased. The Mormon settlers had gained control, but at what cost? The war may have ended, but the echoes of its violence still resonate in the land. The native tribes were decimated, forced onto reservations, their lives upended, while Mormon settlers enjoyed a permanent foothold in the region. Part 7. Circleville Massacre, 1866. The Circleville Massacre of April 1866 stands as one of the most brutal and unforgivable acts in the history of Mormon Native American relations, a slaughter fueled by paranoia, racism, and an unrelenting thirst for control. This wasn't simply a case of violence in wartime. It was a vicious betrayal of trust that marked a disgusting chapter in the Utah Territory's history. By 1866, the Paiutes, one of the tribes in the region, were desperate for peace. They wanted an end to the bloodshed and sought to negotiate with Mormon settlers. These were not warriors or raiders. They were men and women trying to survive, trying to find a way to stop the violence. They approached the Mormon settlers of Circleville under a flag of truce, signaling a desire for negotiation, not confrontation. But what did they get in return? Nothing but suspicion and violence. The settlers, blinded by their own paranoia, viewed these peace-seeking Paiutes as a threat, not as allies. Fearing they were spies or collaborators with hostile tribes, the settlers didn't even give them the courtesy of hearing their plea for peace. Instead, they threw the entire group of 20 Paiutes into a local meeting house, imprisoning them with no evidence, no justification, and no trial. And here's where it gets even darker. Instead of offering mercy, these so-called peaceful settlers decided to execute the prisoners without hesitation or reason. 16 men, elders, young adults, and innocent victims, were bound and gunned down in cold blood. No trial, no due process, just murder. The remaining women and children weren't spared either. They were slaughtered in the days that followed, with only a few managing to escape into the wilderness in a desperate attempt to survive. This wasn't war. This wasn't defense. This was pure slaughter, a ruthless massacre of innocent people who had come in good faith, hoping for peace. The Circleville Massacre wasn't just a tragedy. It was a shocking act of violence that left a scar on Mormon history, and yet it's been ignored or glossed over, as though the lives of these Paiutes meant nothing. Even those within the Mormon community were appalled by the brutality of the act, but the settlers were never held accountable. The massacre was justified by the settlers under the pretense of self-defense, but there's no defense to be found. These Paiutes were never proven to be involved in any hostile activity, yet they were slaughtered for the crime of seeking peace and being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was an act driven by fear, suspicion, and deep-seated racism, an act that only worsened the cycle of violence between settlers and Native American tribes in Utah. The settlers didn't care about justice. They cared about control, about asserting their power and dominance, and the Paiutes paid the price. Historians like David L. Bigler have noted the atrocity, but even today the Circleville Massacre doesn't get the attention it deserves. In his book Fool's Errand, Utah War and the Mormon Rebellion, 2021, Bigler remarks that the massacre represented not only a betrayal of peace, but a sad example of the paranoia that consumed Mormon settlers during the height of the Black Hawk War. These were not soldiers in the heat of battle. These were cowardly murderers, driven by unfounded fear and desperate cruelty. This massacre, though lesser known than other infamous events, is no less significant. It serves as a powerful reminder of what happens when fear and suspicion fuel violence, and when innocent people are victimized simply because they are seen as other. The Circleville Massacre is a glaring, shameful moment in history, one that must not be ignored. It was a slaughter born from mistrust, a massacre driven by racism, and a violent act with no justification whatsoever. The Paiutes who sought peace were betrayed, executed, and erased from history as mere casualties of settlers' paranoia. Their only crime was seeking a better future. The Circleville Massacre is a grim reminder of the darkness that lies beneath the surface of this conflict, and it's a tragedy that should never be forgotten. Thank you so kindly for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon Informant signing off for today.